He invited his ex-wife to his wedding just to prove she was nothing, but when Emily Carter stepped into the ballroom in a simple black dress, the room barely noticed her until the sound of a limousine stopping outside cut through the music. Daniel Brooks smirked, thinking it was just another guest, until the doors opened, and a billionaire stepped out, adjusting his cufflinks before walking straight to her. "Sorry, I'm late, Mrs. Hayes." The room froze. Daniel's smile cracked, and that was the moment he realized this was never his stage, it was hers all along, and he had just been invited to watch himself lose. He invited her to watch him win. But Emily Carter stepped out of the car, knowing this was the night he would finally lose. The ballroom shimmered under crystal chandeliers, each one casting warm gold light across polished marble floors and tables dressed in white linen and quiet wealth. The air smelled of champagne, an expensive perfume, the kind that lingered long after the person left it. The center of it all stood Daniel Brooks, tall, confident, his hand resting at the small of Vanessa Cole's back, as if she were a trophy he had earned. Vanessa was everything the room expected, flawless, poised, wrapped in a designer gown that caught the light with every movement, and Daniel made sure everyone saw her. He laughed a little too loud, shook hands a little too firmly, every gesture carefully crafted to say, "Look at what I chose, look at what I deserve." When Emily entered, no one noticed at first. She wore black, simple, understated, the kind of elegance that didn't ask for attention, but commanded it quietly. Her heels clicked softly against the marble, each step measured, controlled. Her fingers brushed lightly against the clutch in her hand, steady, even as her heartbeat echoed louder than the music. For a moment, she stood near the entrance, watching the scene unfold like a memory she had already outgrown. Daniel hadn't changed, same posture, same smile, the same way he performed success, as if it were a role he could never step out of. She remembered when that smile had been hers, when she had believed it meant something real. Now it felt like watching a stranger wear a face she once loved. A woman from the crowd leaned closer to another, whispering just loud enough to carry, "Isn't that his ex, the one who couldn't keep up?" Emily heard it, the words sliding across the room like something familiar, something she had already survived. She didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing anything break. Instead, she moved forward slowly, her gaze lifting not toward Daniel, but beyond him, scanning the room with quiet precision, as if measuring something invisible, something already decided. Daniel noticed her, then his smile tightening just slightly before returning sharper, more deliberate. "Well, if it isn't Emily," he said, raising his glass as nearby guests turned to watch. "I didn't think you'd actually come." Vanessa followed his gaze, her lips curving into a polite, almost practiced smile, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes. Emily met his look, calm, unreadable. "I was invited," she said simply, her voice even almost soft. Daniel let out a small laugh, gesturing around him. "Welcome then. I hope you enjoy the evening. It's quite something, isn't it?" The way he said it carried more than words. It carried distance, comparison, the quiet reminder of where he believed she stood now. Emily let her eyes drift across the chandeliers, the tables, the carefully curated perfection, before returning to him. As she replied, and for a brief second something flickered behind her calm, something that didn't belong to the woman he thought he knew. Outside, the faint low rumble of an engine rolled to a stop just beyond the tall glass doors, unnoticed by most, but not by her. And for the first time that night, Emily Carter allowed herself the smallest, almost imperceptible smile. The music swelled again, as if the room itself refused to acknowledge the shift that had just begun, but Emily Carter felt it in the air, a subtle tightening, like the moment before a storm breaks. She moved further into the ballroom, her presence no longer invisible, as quiet glances began to follow her, whispers trailing behind like silk threads. Daniel watched her more closely now, his glass hovering near his lips, but untouched. There was something about her stillness that unsettled him, something he could not quite name. Vanessa leaned in slightly, her voice low and sweet. "Do you know her?" Daniel forced a casual shrug. "My past," he said lightly, nothing more, but his eyes did not leave Emily, not even for a second. Emily stopped near one of the tall windows overlooking the city lights, the skyline stretching endlessly in shades of gold and shadow. For a brief moment, her reflection stared back at her in the glass, not the woman he had left behind, not the one who had once stood beside him, trying to be enough. This version of her was quieter, sharper, as if every piece of her had been rebuilt with intention. A server passed by offering champagne. She took a glass, more for the motion than the drink. Her fingers steady as she lifted it just slightly, but did not sip. The faint sound of the engine outside grew louder this time, noticeable. A sleek black limousine pulling into view beyond the entrance, its polished surface catching the light. Like a moving mirror, a few guests near the doors turned, curious murmurs beginning to ripple through the crowd. That is odd, someone whispered. Who else is arriving this late? Daniel frowned, his brows drawing together, the timing irritating him. This was supposed to be his moment, his carefully designed stage, and yet something was shifting beyond his control. Emily did not turn immediately. She let the moment stretch, her gaze still resting on the city, before finally lowering the glass in her hand and glancing toward the entrance. The doors remained closed, but the energy around them had changed, as if the entire room was holding its breath, waiting. Without knowing why, Vanessa straightened, subtly adjusting the fabric of her gown, her smile tightening just a fraction. Sensing the attention slipping, Daniel set his glass down with a quiet clink, his voice dropping as he stepped closer to Emily. You always did have a talent for showing up at the wrong time. Emily turned, then, meeting his gaze fully for the first time, her expression calm, almost distant. Maybe it just feels wrong to you, she replied, her tone even, but carrying something deeper, something he could not quite reach. Before he could respond, the doors opened. A rush of cooler night air slipped into the room, carrying with it the distant hum of the city, and something else, something heavier. The conversations around them softened, then stilled. Heads turned one by one like a wave moving through the crowd. Emily did not move. She did not need to. She already knew, and as footsteps echoed across the marble floor, slow, deliberate, unmistakably confident, a shadow stretched forward under the chandelier light, stopping just at her feet. The man stepped fully into the light, and the room seemed to shift around him, conversations dissolving into silence. As his presence settled over the space, with quiet authority, he moved without hesitation. Each step measured the soft echo of his shoes against the marble, drawing every eye in the room toward him. His suit was tailored perfectly, dark and precise, but it was not the fabric that commanded attention. It was the way people instinctively recognized him. A name passed through the crowd in hushed disbelief. Alexander Hayes. Daniel felt it before he understood it, the subtle change in posture from the guests, the way shoulders straightened, voices lowered, as if something more important had just entered their orbit. Vanessa's fingers tightened slightly around Daniel's arm, her smile faltering for the first time. Who is that? She whispered, but Daniel did not answer, because he already knew, or at least he thought he did. Alexander Hayes was not a man who simply attended events. He owned them in ways that were rarely spoken out loud. His investments shaped industries, his decisions moved markets. And yet here, he was walking across the floor, not toward the center, not toward the hosts, but toward Emily. He stopped just in front of her, close enough that the space between them felt intentional, not accidental. For a moment, he said nothing, his gaze steady on hers, as if the rest of the room no longer existed. And then, with a small apologetic smile that softened the sharpness of his presence, he spoke. Sorry, I am late. Emily, there was something in the way. He said her name, not performative, not for the audience, but familiar, grounded, like a truth that did not need explanation. Emily's expression did not change, but something in her eyes shifted, a quiet recognition, a calm acceptance, as if everything had unfolded exactly as expected. You are right on time, she replied, her voice low but clear. The words carried farther than they should have, cutting through the stillness. Daniel took a step forward, unable to stop himself, his voice sharper than intended. Emily, what is this? Alexander turned slightly, then his gaze moving to Daniel, not with hostility, not with interest, but with a kind of distant acknowledgement, as if placing a name to a face he had already decided did not matter. Emily did not look at Daniel. She did not need to. Instead, Alexander extended his hand gently toward her, and she placed her fingers in his without hesitation, the movement simple, effortless, but final. The gesture alone was enough to fracture the illusion Daniel had built all evening. The guests were watching now, not with curiosity, but with understanding, pieces falling into place in real time. Vanessa slowly let go of Daniel's arm, her attention shifting completely as the reality of the moment settled in. Emily finally turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting Daniel's for a brief second, not angry, not bitter, just distant, like looking at something that belonged to a life she had already left behind. You should enjoy your evening, Daniel, she said softly before her gaze returned forward. Alexander's hand remained steady, guiding her not away, but forward through the room, as if the space itself belonged to them. The crowd parted, instinctively creating a path without being asked, and as Daniel stood there surrounded by everything he thought proved his success, he felt something unfamiliar, something he had never prepared for, the realization that none of it had ever been enough. The path opened before them, without a word spoken, as if the room itself understood where power truly belonged. Emily walked beside Alexander, not ahead, not behind, but exactly where she chose to be, her steps unhurried, her posture effortless yet unshakable. The chandeliers above seemed brighter, now catching the subtle sheen of her dress as conversations resumed in quiet murmurs, but no one returned to what they had been saying before. Every glance followed her now, not with pity, not with curiosity, but with something closer to respect. Daniel remained where he stood, the echo of her voice still lingering in his ears. "You should enjoy your evening." It was not a challenge, not an accusation. It was something worse. It was indifference. Vanessa shifted beside him, her earlier confidence slipping into something more uncertain, her voice lower. "Now, Daniel, what is going on? Why is she with him?" Daniel did not answer, because the question itself felt like an accusation. He could not respond to. Across the room, a man from the investment circle stepped closer to another, whispering, "That is Emily Carter. I thought she disappeared." "No," came the reply, quieter, more careful. "She did not disappear. She pivoted." Daniel's jaw tightened, the word landing heavier than it should have. Pivoted, as if everything he had taken from her, everything he had dismissed, had not been an ending, but a beginning. Emily stopped near the center of the ballroom, not to claim attention, but because it naturally settled around her. Alexander leaned slightly toward her, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You handled that exactly how I expected." A faint smile touched her lips. "Not exactly," she replied softly. "I almost said more." Alexander studied her for a moment, then nodded. "But you did not. That is why this works." Emily's gaze moved across the room, briefly passing over familiar faces, people who once knew her or thought they did. She saw the shift in their expressions, the recalibration of their understanding, and she felt nothing, no satisfaction, no bitterness, only distance. Daniel finally moved, stepping forward through the crowd, each stride sharper than the last, until he stood just a few feet away, his voice controlled but strained. "Emily, we need to talk." The music seemed to fade again, though it never fully stopped. Emily turned her head slightly, acknowledging him, without fully facing him. "There is nothing to talk about," she said calmly. Daniel let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "You show up here with him, and you think there is nothing to say?" Alexander's presence shifted subtly, not stepping in, not interrupting, but existing in a way that made the space feel smaller around Daniel. Emily met Daniel's gaze fully now, and for the first time, he saw it clearly. There was no trace of the woman he used to know, no hesitation, no need for approval, only clarity. "You already said everything, Daniel," she replied quietly. "Just not tonight." The words settled heavier than anything she could have raised her voice to say. Daniel searched her face, as if looking for something familiar, something he could still control, but there was nothing left to find around them. The room had changed, the focus no longer on his celebration, no longer on his carefully built image, but on the reality unfolding in front of them. Emily Carter was not the woman he had left behind. She was the one who had walked away and built something he could not see until now. And as Alexander gently placed his hand at the small of her back, guiding her forward once more, Daniel understood something far too late. This had never been about her returning to his world. She had created one where he no longer belonged. Emily did not look back as she moved through the ballroom beside Alexander, the weight of 100 eyes following her, no longer something to endure, but something that simply existed without meaning. The music regained its rhythm, but it no longer controlled the room. Conversations returned in fragments, yet every voice seemed softer, as if recalibrated around a new center of gravity. She could feel it, the shift, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, like a current running just beneath the surface. Alexander slowed slightly, guiding her toward a quieter corner near the elevated platform, where the city skyline stretched beyond the glass windows. "You never told me it would feel like this," she said quietly, her voice steady but thoughtful. Alexander glanced at her, a faint curve of understanding in his expression. "People expect noise when something changes," he replied. "They do not expect silence." Emily let her gaze drift across the room again, this time without searching, without measuring. She saw Daniel still standing near the center, his posture rigid, his presence somehow smaller despite everything around him. Vanessa remained beside him, but no longer as close. Her attention divided, her confidence shaken by something she could Not fully grasped, it was not jealousy. Emily realized it was uncertainty, the kind that comes when a narrative no longer holds. Emily turned away before the moment could linger too long. It did not belong to her anymore. Across the room, a member of the event staff approached Alexander with a polite nod. "Mr. Hayes, they are ready whenever you are." Alexander acknowledged him with a brief glance, then looked back at Emily. "There it is," he said. Softly, Emily followed his gaze toward the stage where subtle preparations had begun. Unnoticed by most guests, a microphone adjusted, a slight repositioning of the lighting. It had all been arranged long before she stepped into the room. "You planned this," she said, not as a question, but as a recognition. Alexander shook his head slightly. "Not this," he replied. "You did." Emily's brow lifted just a fraction. He continued, his tone calm. "You chose to walk in, you chose to stand there, you chose not to respond. That is the only part that matters." For a moment, Emily said nothing, the truth of it settling into place more clearly than anything else tonight had offered. She had not come to reclaim anything. She had not come to prove anything. She had come because she no longer needed to avoid a past that had already lost its hold. The host's voice began to rise over the soft hum of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I may have your attention." Conversations faded again, more quickly this time, anticipation replacing curiosity. Daniel turned instinctively toward the stage, his expression tightening as he realized the focus of the evening was about to shift in a way he had not anticipated. Emily felt Alexander's presence beside her, steady, unintrusive as always, but unmistakably aligned with her. He did not pull her forward. He did not announce her. Instead, he simply waited. And then, as the host continued, "Tonight, we are honored to recognize a new principal investor whose recent acquisition has reshaped the future of this company." A ripple moved through the crowd, confusion turning into recognition. Piece by piece, Daniel's breath caught almost imperceptibly as realization began to form before the name was even spoken. Emily did not move. She did not step forward. She did not need to. The light shifted slightly across the room, and for the first time that evening it did not find Daniel at the center. It found her. The name landed in the room with a weight that no one could ignore. Emily Carter. A brief pause followed, as if even the host understood the shift that had just occurred. Before continuing, "Principal investor and strategic partner in Hayes Holdings." A silence spread outward, not empty, but heavy, filled with the sound of people rethinking everything they thought they knew. Daniel's vision tunneled for a moment, the words not fully registering until the meaning caught up with him. Investor partner, Hayes Holdings, the same company that had quietly acquired controlling interest in his firm just weeks ago. The deal he had dismissed as a routine transition, now standing in front of him in the form of the woman he had once convinced himself was nothing. Emily did not step forward immediately. She allowed the moment to breathe, the recognition to settle across the faces in the room one by one. Alexander turned slightly toward her, not presenting her, but acknowledging what was already undeniable. When she finally moved, it was unhurried, each step toward the stage measured not for effect, but because there was no need to rush. The light followed her naturally, as if it had always belonged there. Her heels made the softest sound against the floor, yet it carried farther than any announcement. Vanessa's hand slipped from Daniel's arm completely, now her attention fixed on Emily with a look that was no longer composed, no longer certain, but searching. Daniel took a step forward, then stopped himself, the instinct to interrupt colliding with the realization that there was nothing he could do. The stage was no longer his. Emily reached the microphone, and for a brief moment, she looked out at the room, not scanning, not seeking approval, just seeing it clearly. The same kind of room that had once made her feel small now felt distant, almost insignificant. "Thank you for the introduction," she began, her voice calm, steady, carrying without effort. "I believe growth is often misunderstood as something loud, something visible, but sometimes it is simply the decision to stop shrinking." A quiet ripple moved through the crowd, not applause, not yet, but something deeper, something closer to understanding. Daniel's chest tightened, the words striking closer than any direct accusation ever could. Emily continued, her gaze unwavering. "Companies evolve," she said. "People do as well, and when they do, the direction changes, whether others are ready for it or not." Her eyes moved briefly across the room, passing over Daniel for only a fraction of a second, not lingering, not confronting, just acknowledging before moving on. That was the difference. He realized she did not need him to see her anymore. The recognition came from everywhere else. The host stepped forward again, offering a congratulatory gesture, but even that felt secondary to what had already been said. Emily inclined her head slightly, then stepped back, not waiting for validation, not staying to hold the moment longer than necessary. As she descended from the stage, Alexander was already there, his presence unchanged, his expression calm, as if this outcome had never been in question. Around them the room shifted once more, conversations reigniting, but with a different tone, a different center. Daniel stood frozen in place, the noise returning around him, yet none of it reaching him, the realization settling fully now, not sudden, but absolute. He had spent the entire evening trying to prove that he had moved on, while she had quietly built a life that had already moved far beyond him. And as Emily walked past him once more without hesitation, without pause, he understood something he could not undo. He had not been left behind, he had simply been outgrown. The applause came late, not explosive, but steady. The kind that builds when people are no longer reacting to a moment, but adjusting to a new reality. Emily barely acknowledged it as she stepped away from the stage, the sound fading behind her, like something already completed. Alexander fell in a step beside her, his presence quiet, as always, yet unmistakably aligned with hers. You did not need to say much, he said softly. Emily exhaled slowly, not from relief, but from release. It was never about saying more, she replied. It was about not saying anything at all that they could use against me. Alexander gave a small nod, as if confirming something he had known long before. Tonight, across the room, Daniel finally moved again, the stiffness in his posture breaking into something less controlled, more urgent. He crossed the floor quickly, ignoring the subtle shifts in attention that followed him. No longer admiration, but observation. Vanessa hesitated before following a few steps behind her, earlier composure replaced by attention she could not disguise. Daniel stopped in front of Emily again, this time without the confidence he had carried all evening, his voice lower, but edged with something closer to disbelief. You bought into my company, he said, not as a question, but as a realization forming too late. Emily tilted her head slightly, not defensive, not proud, simply factual. It is not your company anymore, she said quietly. The words landed with precision, not sharp, but undeniable. Daniel let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. You think this is some kind of statement, he said, his voice tightening. You walk in here with him with all of this, and expect me to believe this is not about me? Emily looked at him fully now, and for a moment, there was something almost gentle in her expression, not sympathy, but clarity. That is where you are wrong, Daniel. She said it was never about you. That was the part he could not process, the absence of himself in her decisions, in her success, in the life she had built without him around them. The room continued to shift, conversations forming in quieter tones, names being mentioned, deals being reconsidered. Emily could feel it, the ripple effect already in motion, but it did not belong to her to manage anymore. She had done her part. Vanessa stepped forward, then her voice carefully composed, but unable to hide the strain. You knew about this, she asked Daniel, her eyes searching his face for an answer he could not give. Daniel did not respond immediately, his focus still locked on Emily, as if waiting for something else, some explanation, some reaction that would return the balance to something he understood. But Emily had already stepped out of that equation entirely. Alexander glanced toward her, a silent question in his eyes, and she answered it with the smallest nod. That was enough. Without another word, he shifted slightly, creating space for her to move, and she did not hesitate. Emily stepped past Daniel, not brushing against him, not acknowledging him further, her path clear and uninterrupted. The distance between them was no longer physical, it was final. Daniel turned slightly, watching her go, the noise of the room rising again around him, yet none of it reaching the place where the realization had settled. Vanessa remained beside him, but even that felt uncertain now, like something that no longer fit the image he had constructed. And as Emily reached the doors once more, the cool air from outside slipping in as they opened, Daniel understood the one thing he had never prepared for: not losing her, but becoming irrelevant to the life she had chosen to live. The night air felt different the moment Emily stepped outside, cooler, quieter, untouched by the tension she had just left behind. The city stretched out before her, lights flickering across glass towers and distant streets humming with life that did not pause for anyone. She took a slow breath, not to steady herself, but to feel the absence of everything that no longer mattered behind her. The doors closed softly, sealing the noise of the ballroom away, as if it belonged to another world entirely. Alexander stepped beside her, adjusting his cuffs slightly, his gaze following the skyline. You always leave before they understand, he said. Emily let a faint smile touch her lips. They do not need to understand, she replied, They just need to remember the limousine waited at the curb, its engine running low and steady, a quiet contrast to the chaos. She had just walked through. A driver opened the door without a word, but Emily did not move immediately, her eyes lingering on the reflection of the ballroom lights in the glass behind her. Not drawn to it, just acknowledging its existence like something already finished inside the room. Daniel had not moved far from where she left him, the conversations around him a shifting tone as people approached more cautiously, now not with admiration, but with curiosity and calculation. A man from the board reached him first, his voice polite, but edged with something new. "We should discuss the transition," he said, glancing briefly toward the doors where Emily had exited. Daniel nodded automatically, but his attention remained fractured, pieces of the evening replaying in a sequence he could not reorder. Emily's voice, her calm, her absence of reaction, the way the room had turned without her asking. Vanessa stood a few feet away, now her posture no longer aligned with his, her silence heavier than any question she could have asked. Daniel turned slightly toward her, as if expecting something, reassurance perhaps, or alignment, but what he found instead was distance, not dramatic, not confrontational, just real. Outside, Emily finally stepped forward, sliding into the limousine. With a quiet ease, Alexander followed, the door closing behind them, sealing the space in a soft hush that felt almost unreal compared to the noise they had left. The car began to move smoothly, merging into the rhythm of the city lights, passing in reflections across the windows. "You did not look back," Alexander said. After a moment, Emily rested her hand lightly against the cool glass, watching the streets blur past. "I already lived that part," she replied. "There is nothing back there for me now." Alexander studied her briefly, then leaned back, his expression unreadable, but certain. The car continued forward, each block placing more distance between her and the life she once navigated inside the ballroom. Daniel finally exhaled, the tension breaking into something quieter, more permanent, not anger, not even regret, but the slow realization of consequence. He looked around the room at the same faces, the same setting, the same celebration that had felt like victory just an hour ago, and understood none of it had changed except the way it reflected him. And for the first time that night, the silence around him was not something he controlled, it was something he had to stand inside alone. The city moved around them in a steady rhythm, headlights stretching into long lines of white and red as the limousine carried Emily farther from the night that had quietly rewritten itself. She watched the reflections glide across the window, not searching for anything, just letting the motion settle into something calm, something final. Alexander remained silent beside her, not out of distance, but out of understanding. He did not interrupt what did not need words. After a moment, he spoke. "You knew he would try to stop you." Emily did not turn her gaze from the glass. "He always needed to feel in control," she said softly. "That does not change just because I am no longer part of his world." Alexander nodded slightly. "And yet you walked into it anyway this time." Emily did turn her head, her expression composed but clear. "I did not walk into his world," she said. "I walked into a room he happened to be in." The distinction lingered between them, quiet but undeniable. Outside, the city lights shifted as the car turned onto a broader avenue, the skyline opening wider as if mirroring the space she had created for herself inside the ballroom. Daniel stood near the bar, now his reflection staring back at him from the mirrored surface behind the shelves of glass and amber liquid. A bartender asked him something he did not hear. Vanessa approached again, slower this time, her voice careful. "Daniel, we need to talk." He exhaled quietly, his hand resting against the edge of the counter as if grounding himself. "Talk about what?" he asked without looking at her. Vanessa hesitated, then answered. "About what just happened." "About her." Daniel let out a short breath, his eyes finally lifting to meet his own reflection. "She made an investment," he said flatly, as if reducing it could restore its scale. Vanessa shook her head slightly. "No, Daniel, she did not just make an investment, she replaced you." The word settled heavier than anything else that night had delivered. Daniel turned toward her fully, now something in his expression tightening, not in anger, but in recognition, a truth he could not argue against. Around them, the room had resumed its movement, but it felt different. Conversations carried more weight, glances lingered longer, alliances already beginning to shift in quiet, subtle ways that no one would openly acknowledge, but everyone would act on. Daniel could feel it, the slow recalibration of how he was seen, not immediate, not dramatic, but inevitable. He straightened slightly, adjusting his jacket, as if the gesture could restore something intangible but it did not reach where the change had already taken hold outside. The limousine slowed briefly at a red light, the city stretching ahead in quiet layers of motion. Emily leaned back slightly, her fingers resting loosely in her lap, the tension of the evening no longer present, only a steady clarity. Alexander glanced toward her. There will be questions, he said eventually. Emily allowed a faint smile to return. Let them ask, she replied. I am not hiding anymore. The light changed, and the car moved forward again, smooth, uninterrupted, carrying her deeper into a future that did not require explanation. Behind her, Daniel remained in a room that still looked the same, still sounded the same, but no longer responded to him the way it once had, and as the distance between them grew, it became clear the most irreversible change of the night was not what she had gained, but what he could no longer reach. The limousine came to a smooth stop beneath the soft glow of a private entrance, where the city felt quieter, more selective, as if even the noise knew where it was no longer welcome. The driver stepped out, opening the door with practiced precision, but Emily remained seated for a moment, her gaze fixed ahead, not on the building, not on the night, but on the stillness that had finally settled inside her. Alexander did not rush her, he simply waited. You can take your time, he said softly. Emily let out a slow breath, not heavy, not relieved, just complete. I am not taking my time, she replied. I am just not rushing anymore. She stepped out onto the pavement, her heels meeting the ground, with a quiet finality that felt different from earlier tonight. This was not an entrance, this was a continuation. Inside the building, the atmosphere shifted immediately, warm lighting, soft textures, a space designed not to impress, but to belong. Emily moved through it with ease, not because it was new, but because it was hers in a way that did not depend on anyone else. Alexander followed beside her, his presence steady. You changed the direction of more than one company tonight, he said as they walked. Emily glanced at him briefly. I changed mine first, she replied. The rest followed. Meanwhile, across the city, the ballroom had thinned slightly, the energy no longer sharp, but unsettled as conversations continued in lower tones. Daniel stood near the edge of the room, now no longer at its center, no longer surrounded in the same way. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. People still spoke to him, but their attention moved differently, their eyes drifting more often, their words more measured, as if reassessing where he stood. Vanessa had stepped away entirely, now her absence another quiet fracture in the image he had constructed. Daniel finally picked up his glass, but did not drink. He only held it, watching the reflection of the room distort across its surface. For the first time that evening, there was no performance left in him, only the slow recognition of something he could not reframe. He had believed success was something you displayed, something you proved, something others confirmed, but what Emily had done required none of that. She had not argued, she had not competed, she had simply existed in a way that made everything else adjust around him. Someone mentioned her name again, not loudly, but clearly enough. Emily Carter. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief second, the sound of it no longer tied to memory, but to reality, something current, something undeniable. He opened them again, but nothing had changed except his understanding. Outside in the quiet building, Emily reached a set of glass doors overlooking a private terrace, the city stretching endlessly beyond. She paused, not to reflect, but to feel the absence of weight. Alexander stepped beside her, his voice low. You did not need to come tonight. Emily looked out at the skyline, her expression calm, almost distant. I know, she said, but I needed to see that I would not shrink anymore. The words settled into the space between them, steady and unshaken. Alexander nodded once, not as approval, but as recognition, and as the city lights flickered across the glass and the distance between past and present finally became something she could no longer measure, Emily understood this was never about returning, it was about no longer belonging to anything that once held her back. The terrace doors slid open with a soft whisper, and the night air carried a quiet stillness that felt untouched by expectation. Emily stepped out onto the stone floor, the city stretching below her in endless lines of light, no longer overwhelming, no longer distant, just present. Alexander remained just inside, watching her, not intruding, not guiding, simply allowing her the space she had created for herself. Emily rested her hands lightly on the railing, the cool metal grounding her in a way nothing else had tonight. There was a time she would have stood like this, searching for answers, searching for reassurance, searching for something outside herself to make sense of what she felt, but that instinct was gone, replaced by something steadier, something quieter, certainty. You were thinking about him, Alexander said from behind her, not as a question. Emily shook her head slightly. I am thinking about why I ever thought I needed him, she replied. Her voice carried no bitterness, no regret, only clarity, as if the answer had finally settled into place. Without resistance, Alexander stepped out beside her now, his gaze following hers across the skyline. It is easier to see clearly when you are no longer standing inside the same frame, he said. Emily let out a small breath, almost a quiet laugh. Not clearer, she corrected, just honest. Behind them inside the building, a phone vibrated softly on a nearby table. Alexander glanced toward it, but did not move. Emily noticed. You can take it, she said. He looked at the screen briefly, then back at her. It will wait, he replied. Nothing here is urgent anymore. Emily turned, slightly studying him, not for what he offered, not for what he represented, but for the consistency of his presence. You always knew how this would unfold, she said. He shook his head. No, he answered. I just knew you would not stay where you were not meant to grow. The words settled between them, not heavy, not dramatic, just true. Across the city, in a room that still held the echo of everything that had changed, Daniel finally stepped outside onto the balcony attached to the ballroom. The air there colder, sharper, the noise behind him muffled, but still present. He leaned against the railing, his reflection faint in the glass beside him. For a moment, he did not recognize the expression staring back at him, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was unguarded. There was no one to perform for out here, no one to convince, no one to impress, just him. And the quiet realization that had been building all night. He thought about what he had said to her years ago, the small, dismissive comments, the subtle ways he had reduced her ambitions into something manageable, something he could understand. He had never raised his voice, never needed to. The damage had been quieter than that, more precise, and now standing in a space that felt strangely smaller than it had hours before, he understood something he could not undo. She had not needed him to break her to leave him. She had only needed to see herself clearly. Once Emily stepped back from the railing, the night no longer holding her attention in the same way. It was no longer something she escaped into. It was simply part of where she stood now. Alexander watched her expression shift. Not asking, not pushing. You are done, she said simply. Not with tonight, not with him, but with everything that once defined her, by what it lacked. And as she turned to step back, inside, the city lights continued their steady rhythm below, unchanged, unaware that for the first time in a long time, Emily Carter was no longer measuring her life against anything she had lost, only against what she had chosen to become. When Emily stepped back inside the quiet elegance of the building, the space seemed to recognize her differently, not because it had changed, but because she had. The soft lighting traced her outline as she walked past polished surfaces and muted reflections, no longer observing herself in them, but moving through them without pause. Alexander followed a step behind, then matched her pace, his presence steady. Without question, you will start receiving calls tomorrow, he said calmly. Board members, partners, people who suddenly remember your name. Emily gave a small nod, her expression unchanged. Let them remember, she replied. I did not build any of this to stay invisible. They moved toward a private lounge where the city lights filtered in through tall glass panels, casting long shadows across the room. Emily paused briefly at the entrance, not out of hesitation, but awareness, the kind that comes when you recognize a threshold you have already crossed. Alexander watched her for a moment before speaking again. You never asked for anything tonight. Emily looked at him, then not searching, but certain. I already have everything I needed, she said. There was no arrogance in her tone, no need to emphasize the statement, because it was not meant to prove anything. It simply was. Across the city, Daniel remained on the balcony longer than he intended, the air growing colder as the night deepened around him. Inside the ballroom, the event continued, but its meaning had shifted. No longer a celebration he controlled, but a setting he no longer defined. He finally stepped back inside the warmth of the room, feeling unfamiliar, not because it had changed, but because his place in it had. Vanessa was no longer waiting for him, her absence more telling than any confrontation could have been. Conversations paused briefly as he re-entered, not out of respect, but recognition, a quiet recalibration of how he was seen. He walked past them, without stopping, without engaging. The performance he had maintained all evening no longer sustainable, because it no longer reflected anything real. A man approached him cautiously, mentioning the acquisition again, the transition, the future. Daniel listened, but did not respond immediately, his thoughts not on the logistics, not on the numbers, but on the realization beneath them. All he had believed control came from holding on, from shaping outcomes, from ensuring that everything moved within his reach. But Emily had shown him something else. Without ever saying it, control was never about possession, it was about direction, and she had changed hers long before he noticed. Back in the lounge, Emily stood near the glass, her reflection faint against the city beyond, but no longer something. She measured herself against Alexander, joined her, placing a folder on the table nearby. "There are a few documents that will need your signature in the morning," he said. "Routine, nothing urgent." Emily glanced at the folder briefly, then back at the skyline. "Tomorrow is fine," she said. "Tonight is finished." The words settled into the room with a quiet finality, not heavy, not dramatic, just complete. And in that moment, there was nothing left unresolved, nothing left unsaid, because the story that once defined her had already ended long before she walked into that ballroom. Tonight had not been about rewriting it. It had been about proving to herself that she no longer belonged to it at all.